At the start of what could be a key week of diplomacy, with US officials due in Moscow, what are the Russian papers saying this morning on the prospects for a deal to end Russia's war on Ukraine? Well, if you read the editorial in Nezavisima Gazeta, the chances of Moscow compromising are low. Will Trump's envoys be able to convince Putin to accept their plan? Geopolitical reality means we shouldn't count on Russia making noticeable concessions. No illusions. But there is always room for a miracle. The gist of this piece is that the West is to blame for the war in Ukraine and for undermining the rules-based international order, and that Russia has the staying power that the West doesn't. After nearly 4 years of the special military operation, Russia's war in Ukraine, after the transition of Russia's economy, finances and politics to a war footing, it is not impossible to convince Russians to tighten their belts, to ensure the complete and unconditional surrender of Kiev and its allies. And already on the final ruins of Kiev and the rules-based order, start building a new European security architecture from the position of strength of the victor. All of the above should be borne in mind by those who are trying to predict the outcome of Vladimir Putin's talks with Trump's envoys. No illusions, but there is always room for a miracle. The message coming out of Moscow in recent days has been that Russia is ready to fight on if it doesn't get the deal it wants. Look at what Izvestia writes, quoting a Russian diplomat. As the conflict develops, the conditions for Kiev inevitably deteriorate, and the prospects for negotiations will depend on the willingness of the Ukrainian side to prioritise ending the bloodshed. See how reality is turned upside down here. It was Russia that invaded Ukraine. Russia continues to wage war on Ukraine, and yet here a Russian diplomat claims that peace depends on Ukraine ending the bloodshed. And see how Izvestia presents the current peace talks. The peace plan proposed by the American side, which involves a cessation of hostilities and a transition to a political settlement, creates a rare opportunity to stabilise the situation. However, it is Kiev that demonstrates the greatest unwillingness to compromise, and without that, an end to the conflict seems unlikely. One of the central points of the document is the recognition of the new territorial arrangement that has developed. What is proposed is confirming the status of Crimea and the Donbass, as well as fixing the line of contact in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. These provisions reflect the actual situation on the ground and are intended to resolve the issue of further escalation around these territories. Ukraine categorically rejects such proposals. When Izvestia refers to the status of the Donbass, no mention that Russia does not control all of the Donbass, that Moscow is demanding Ukraine hand over territory Russia has failed to seize militarily in 4 years of war. If the latest peace initiative comes to nothing, Russia will almost certainly blame Ukraine for that and encourage the Trump administration to do the same. Moskovsky Komsomolets seems pleased that when it comes to these peace talks, Europe is not at the table. Europe has reached the event horizon of a black hole. Cross it, and there's no way back. The EU will lose its identity in international relations. Its opinion on the Russian-Ukrainian peace process is no longer invited by the real parties of the conflict, Russia and the US. So European resistance to the peace process will only grow, and it's impossible to predict how it will end. With a split inside the EU, the cracks have already started, with Europe being drawn into a direct conflict with Russia, there are too many hypotheticals. Everything is changing too quickly and chaotically. The Russian government paper Rossiyskaya Gazeta claims that Washington doesn't even want to see the counter-proposal which they attempted to draw up in European capitals in response to US peace initiatives. But despite no obvious signs of compromise by Moscow, could there be an agreement this week? Some kind of deal? Remember, that Nezavisima Gazeta editorial did suggest there's always room for a miracle. Miracles aside, Rossiyskaya Gazeta does ask this question: will plans lead to Budapest? In other words, is this building up to a peace summit in Budapest? While noting that the concrete parameters of possible agreements are still unclear, the newspaper does go on to report that after talks in the US delegation led by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will go to Moscow, and if the proposals they bring are acceptable to Russia, then one could talk of a peace summit in Budapest. Is this one of the reasons Viktor Orban visited Moscow last Friday? As Komsomolskaya Pravda reports, Hungary's Prime Minister told Vladimir Putin that Hungary is ready to provide a platform for talks and help bring the peace process to a successful conclusion. Talking of miracles, that word pops up again on the front page of Nezavisima Gazeta today. Russia's October economic miracle. However, abnormal growth in one autumn month did not reduce the risks of a recession in 2026. Official statistics recorded a real economic miracle in Russia. In 1 month, domestic industry increased production by almost 11%. Such unprecedented growth rates of production are put down to a jump in the production of defence goods, as well as extraction and oil refining. But a more plausible explanation is the peculiarities of accounting. Similar anomalies were observed before, in December each year, when enterprises collectively reported on the implementation of all production plans. At the same abnormal rate, plus 11% a month, it's not only production in Russia that is growing, so is the volume of unpaid wages. Despite the October industrial miracle, the risk of a recession in 2026 in Russia has not decreased. It's actually increased, independent economists say. The general economic malaise is still betrayed by the rise in non-payment of wages, as well as by the deterioration in the general financial performance of enterprises.